and I ripped it off my lamp. So, all right.
Oh my goodness.
Here we go.
Yeah.
See.
Just gonna start. It's just gonna take me a minute to get the signal going, and then once that signal is going, I'll let people in just a sec here.
All right.
Oh, cool.
All right, just give it a sec here for people to join, and then we will do our intro. All right, you guys are good to go.
Okay, hello for coming, everyone. So if we're ready to start rolling, unfortunately Barb was supposed to host and she's not available right now. Maybe she'll join on a bit later. So I'm kind of taking over as host and as our second speaker. Before we formally get started, I am going to open with a Hadkill prayer from Lawrence Bell, Victoria Edgars, and Marianne Ignace, just to open up in a good way. So, Salana sanang it lagadas, atlan lang kagan la sang dang al kiltlagang, gast iske lagalti, ga gudange stis hansen lagalti, da'u it a la'atsang dang al kiltlagang hoa. So I'm very excited about the speaker series. It was created out of conversations with my group at UBC, co-creating aquatic science. And we have some of our team members on here today, Andrea Reed, Sarah Harper, Margot Hessing-Lewis. We started chatting with people at the Council of the Haida Nation, as well as the Haida Gwaii Institute. So through our conversations with Valine Brown before she wrapped up at CHN Communications, she came up with the idea of a Haida speaker series, and we've kind of ran with that. And we're very excited to present it as a collaboration between CHN, HGI, and UBC. And it's a really big honor to have Wendy Smythe here. She is, let me find the bio. She has a PhD and she's Alaskan Haida from Heidelberg, Alaska. Her Haida name is Ka'skahua, from the Stastis Eagle Clan. She's an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota Duluth with a joint appointment in the departments of American Indian Studies and Earth and Environmental Science. And with that, I'm ready to pass it off to hear more from you. How so much?
Oh, let me get my slide shared. So how for having me. I'm going to talk tonight about some of the work that I do, looking at the importance of connection to place for Native youth in science education. But first, let me introduce myself formally in Hadkill. Hadalas et unsant die gudele lagen, die hadas hat agen, sonatla stastis onai hatai udi ijung. Gust akas gusturi kwalagen. Die klingwai klakia igagen. Skat lua hinu dekeong, Wendy Smythe, hinu dekeong, Donna Douglas di al uijung. Alec Ruth Douglas di chin di nanu ijung. Sam, Elsie, Dichin, Dinanu Ijung, James and Annie, Dichin, Dinanu Ijung, Sanahat and Kate, Dichin, Dinanu Ijung, Hikta, Handalai, Stuth Ijung. So I'm happy to be here with you. I'm a Sanatlas Stastis fish egg of the Eagle Moiety. I told you who my family was. I'm the daughter of Donna Douglas, the granddaughter of Alec and Ruth, the great-granddaughter of Sam and Elsie, the great-great-great-granddaughter or great-great-granddaughter of James and Annie, and the great-great-great-granddaughter of Sanuhut and Kate. And this picture up here is my grandparents from Sanuhut to James to my Nana Elsie. And this is my, let's see if this will advance. This is my mother. And I often look at this picture and wonder, what would they have thought of this weird looking 13-year-old me that lived in Heidelberg with the bad haircut and big glasses and the awesome unicorn rainbow shirt. That Stahiwa would have never imagined the journey that I would have been on that would have allowed me to be a cultural practitioner that I am today, an oceanographer, and an environmental scientist, an activist, and most importantly, the greatest honor is I have the ability to mentor the youth in our community in Heidelberg. And so I want to start with that, telling you who I am, and let you know that when we have these conversations and when I share, I'm speaking as a Haida woman, not as a scholar, and about my journey through academia and science and in colonized spaces as a Haida woman. And so when we're doing this, we're in ceremony together, and I'm sharing knowledge with you with respect, and hope that when we have discussion that we can have a respectful discussion as well. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I just open your mind and listen to the journey that I took and how it's impacted the work that I do today. So I often, I introduce myself as Dichlingwai Klakia Igogan, as an observer of the world, because oftentimes in academia, we are expected to strip away and get rid of our native identity. And we can't be two people. I can't be a scientist in academia and a Haida woman when I'm home. And so I introduce myself as a Haida scientist because I'm both, no matter where I'm at, whether I'm in a tribal space or a colonized space. And I encourage our students to do that as well, because it's really difficult when we move into these spaces of academia that strip away our identity. As a Haida woman and as a Haida, we're very much connected to the air, land, and water. And these three entities have beinghood, and we understand as Indigenous people that what we do to the land, air and water, it does to us. We have a cultural and traditional use lifestyle. So we are very much caretakers of the space that we occupy. And so that has led me into these different arenas of my career as a geoscientist, looking at groundwater ecosystems and mineralization and biogeochemical cycling. I did all of that, and I said, well, how do we bring that home? And so I started coming home, and I'll talk more about these two spaces that I occupy in Native education. So coupling our traditional knowledge systems with Western science, using our cultural traditions and our language to develop curriculum. And I also work in policy. As a researcher, I do deep sea research. I look at groundwater systems that have a lot of iron and manganese, a lot of metals dissolved in them. And I look at the bacteria that are there, and I look at how they cycle these elements. And so one of the sites I work on is off the coast of Hawaii. It's the next island that will be coming up in thousands of years. It's called Luihi. And we go out on this boat and we sit out there for a month and drop subs off the side, and we get to look at these beautiful landscapes that are underneath the water. This is 1,000 meters deep. And I went out here and worked, and then I went back to Heidelberg one year and saw a site that looks very much like Luihi, but above water. So I started comparing these two systems. They're both groundwater systems. One is volcanic, one is not. They're both high in iron and high in manganese. So I wanted to see, look at the microbial diversity. What bacteria are there? What are they doing? And I also look at that site on Prince of Wales Island as a system for climate change. There's a lot of CO2 that come out of the groundwater and out of those springs. And so it's a natural system for CO2. And some of that work was incorporated into a mural in San Francisco on climate change. And so these are the two systems I work in. So I transitioned some of that work into another sphere of work that I do just by the nature of academia, looking at diversity in science education. And from my own journey, knowing that diversity, whether it's discipline diversity or cultural diversity, it increases our innovation, creativity, productivity. It increases ours and our students' critical thinking skills. And I like to use this red cedar log as an example for scientists to say, if this is your problem or your question or your hypothesis, how do you solve it? So if you had this red cedar, what would you do with it? You needed to get from point A to B. And typically when I ask audiences what they would do with this, we get very similar things are said. I'd build a house, I would build a deck, I would build furniture. But the thing is, we need to get from point A to B. And if we all see the world the same way, we're not going to get anywhere. So when we add diversity, we make a canoe and we get from A to B. And so I'm going to talk tonight on a canoe journey of my career in academia and how diversity should be celebrated and integrated in every part of not only having us occupy these colonized spaces, but having education equity for our students. Oftentimes when we hear about education and going to college, there's a promise, right? It's going to be wonderful. It's going to be exciting. You're going to get to go travel. You're going to get to, you're going to get to, you're going to get to. But often the reality doesn't match the promise. And there's a lot of different reasons why. We hear a lot about recruitment when we talk about academia and education programs, but we don't hear about retention. And I don't want to hear about recruitment anymore. I want to hear about retention. How are you going to train your university, faculty, staff, and administration to meet the needs of our students so that they succeed? Oftentimes when our students go into academia, they experience what we know is an unspoken and unconscious idea that everyone has the right to use natives and native identities as they see fit. And these actions are justified as and rationalized as honoring us, of which we know they're not. Indigeneity is considered a national heritage of the United States and an entitled right, of which it's not. And this mythology of who we are created a narrative that defines not only who we are in mainstream, but what we look like, how we act, what is our intelligence. And all of this has been institutionalized, not only in the United States, but globally. And so our students are constantly being bombarded with this idea of what is a native, who is a native, and who do we represent? We're expected to represent everyone when we know we only represent our family, our clan, and our community. And our students also, these narratives, these deficit narratives that our students experience when they leave their tribal communities laid the foundation for how they're viewed as real. Are they real? Are we real people? Typically we're romanticized as costumes, right? We're hypersexualized costumes, we're mascots, or we're used for other branding. We're viewed as offenders, savages is what we typically hear that we are, when it's really a person defending their home and their family, if we look back at what happened. There's no regard for our culture, our religious ceremonies, our spirituality, because it doesn't have a Western construct. And there's a disregard, a blatant disregard for traditional knowledge systems, of which I would ask a scientist, if our job is to discover and innovate and look at the data, how do we disregard an entire knowledge system? Are we really being good scholars if we can throw out a knowledge system that's not Western and that we're not familiar with? I would say we're not being good scholars if we do that. So I try to look at the intersections of student identity, belonging, and place to create security for our students. So if we look at place, what place do our students grow up in? They have a connection to land. And then when they go into academia, is there a connection to place, and what places are they interacting with? So an example I like to use on the right is in Kasan, Alaska. There's a cultural connection to that place. And on the left is Mount Vernon in Virginia, the home of George Washington. And a lot of students and a lot of people go to this site. And if you ask different groups, what does this site represent? You'll get very different answers. And that's how we have to think of place, the place our students occupy. If you ask a non-diverse person, a white person, what does this mean to you? It's a place of pride. It was where the first president of this country lived. If you ask an indigenous person, what does this place represent to you? It is a place of dispossession of land, loss of culture, language, torture, and death. If you ask an African American, what does this place mean to you? It is, again, a place of loss of culture, loss of life, torture, and rape. So we have to look at what places mean to different groups, and how do we bring students into those spaces, and how do we do it where they're safe and secure. We have to develop student identity, and I'll show you some data at the end of this of how our student identity in Heidelberg has changed through time. But are our students able to say, I can be a scientist, I can be a lawyer, I can be whatever I want to be? Do we allow that? When we look at what mainstream society tells us, that doesn't tell us that we can be what we want to be. So we have to change that narrative and their sense of belonging. A lot of students I work with walk into spaces, whether they're going to school or in internships, and they say that the first thing they say is, I don't identify with anything here. There's no imagery, no one looks like me, I don't feel like I belong. So what I like to tell students, and I show them these maps, one is a language map of Alaska on the right, one is a cultural regional map of the continental United States. What we see is that no matter where you go, you're on indigenous land. And so I tell students to remember that. So when they walk into that space and they feel like they don't belong, know that you belong where you are. You occupy that space for a reason, and you are the dream of your ancestors, and you being in that space is the manifestation of that dream, right? Despite the attempted ethnocide and genocide against our people, you are occupying space and you belong there. You are the one on indigenous land. And so we bring these three components together to create an emotional security for students, okay? So that they can move through academia with confidence. The other thing we have to think about, though, is physical security. And so this is a map that I use with my students when we do field trips or when they travel someplace. This is from the Southern Poverty Law Center. This is a hate map of the United States. All the white spots on there are where identified hate groups are. So when our students travel, we need to be aware of where they're going and if they're going to be secure and safe. I look at obstacles in education. A lot of this is from my own experiences coming from Heidelberg, a community of 350 people, and going to Portland, which was completely overwhelming and took me time to acclimate and be able to get through my degrees as a bachelor's degree and then on to my PhD. And so I have to make sure I look at these and consider this is what our students go through as well. And all of this is grounded in historical traumas as well, which inform and impact these obstacles. So how do we build an education program, pulling science and traditional knowledge together to make sure our students are whole and safe, secure, and have an identity? And then looking at traditional knowledge systems as well. So there's an assumption that there's a hierarchy between traditional knowledge and science and Western science, but there's not. They're completely different knowledge systems. They're distinctive knowledge systems, but at the core where they overlap, they have similar methods for knowledge acquisition. The difference is in who does the science and how it's done. The difference is also in the language used to define and describe those sciences. We see asset-based language when it comes to Western science, and we see deficit language when it comes to traditional knowledge systems. And again, that is because it's an unfamiliar system that most people don't acknowledge. And how do we do science in a place if we're looking at chemistry, if we're looking at botany, if we're looking at geology or soil chemistry? We have to know the history of that place to know what's causing the changes in those sites. Something happened. There was people there that impacted the landscape. And that's part of what's informing our science today. So we have to look at the traditional knowledge. We have to look at history of place to really see what's going on when we're doing research. So I took all of this and tried to fold it in together to develop a place-based education program in Heidelberg. We started it 14 years ago. And keeping in mind that place was key here. Place provides a sense of belonging. And think of when you go where you were a child, it elicits an emotional bond tied to memories, feelings, and sensations, right? And connection is the core of human need. We need to feel connected to place. This next slide takes a second. There we go. So when we look at multiple ways of knowing now, I like to look at traditional knowledge as a cedar woven together. And every square on there is something different. It's math, it's chemistry, it's biology, it's social science, it's spirituality, all together in one concept. And we know that when we talk about fishing and we talk about harvesting, we are considering all these components. And that is how we teach our students until we put them in school. So then at 5 years old, we ask our children to think differently. We ask them to think compartmentalized, right? We take them from a traditional way of knowing into a knowledge system, into an education system that's very different and thinks very differently. And we ask them to reconcile the two at the age of 5. So how do we change our education systems where we have them learn 2 ways of knowing so that they can see the world critically and interpret it in different ways at the same time, develop those critical thinking skills? We have to combine these together. But we also know we have to connect each of these siloed Western concepts of biology, material science, and engineering, which are considered siloed disciplines. But we know that engineering impacts and informs what we know in material science, and it impacts chemistry. So they're all connected, and we still consider concepts from them. We also want to consider traditional knowledge and how traditional knowledge informs and impacts these different knowledge systems. So notice that the arrows are bidirectional because knowledge has to flow in both directions for this to work, right? We know that one informs the other, especially when our students know traditional knowledge and we're asking them to learn biology. They're going to pull these together because that is their life experience. And so we're now taking everything they know and tying it together. Otherwise, we're asking them to push that traditional knowledge down and not consider it at all. And that's difficult to do. And that's what we taught them. That's their lifestyle. So what if we reimagine science teaching? So instead of looking at the water cycle as condensation, precipitation, and evaporation, what if we look at the water cycle as how it impacts salmon runs in rivers and how it impacts weather patterns? Because we know it does. And when we talk to our children at the age of 8, they understand that, right? They understand that they're out fishing and hunting as well. When we use traditional knowledge, though, we have to think of a few things. One is the respect for the intellectual property, the ownership of that property, the acknowledgement that it was created tens of thousands of years ago and is still relevant today, and that the cultural ways of knowing are important for meaning making. Meaning, if you use a knowledge system from the Haida community, you need to understand how the Haida think. Otherwise, you're just interpreting it through your own lens, and what you think it's saying might not be what it's saying at all. So if you use a traditional knowledge system, you really have to have a relationship with that community long-term to understand how they think and what is meant by that knowledge. Our knowledge systems were developed with intention. Every word had intention to pass on information. It wasn't just something thrown together. There was a lot of intention in it. So we used all of this to develop culturally relevant curriculum using a nested model of culture, language, consultation with elders and community members, and then all the research was done in place on rivers and on the coastal ecosystem. And 2 reasons we did this. One, we wanted to create curriculum for the school where the students saw their culture and language reflected in the science. But on the other side of that, our teachers are not Haida. Our teachers are not from our community. So how are they going to teach our children using our way of life and using our knowledge systems? We have to embrace our teachers and we have to teach them too. And we have to develop curriculum with our stories in it so that they understand who we are, so that they can teach them from both a traditional knowledge perspective and a Western science perspective. And so we created curriculum doing just that, considering 2 views of one world. So if you've ever taught youth before, if you talk to them about pH and chemistry, they will fall asleep on you. But if you ask them how to harvest spruce roots and where to harvest spruce roots, they'll start telling you the type of soil, the pH of the soil, the type of plants, what's around them. You can tie that to botany, algebra for weaving, geology of the type of soil, and chemistry. And then we created curriculum around that. We used our moldy salmon story, we used totem poles, and we used our creation story to develop curriculum for our teachers to get that cultural knowledge and for our students to tie these two knowledge systems together. So one of the projects our students did, we did coastal bioassessment. So what we did is we used biology to assess the health of the environment. So now I'm tying in my oceanography research side with our traditional knowledge. And so we used shipworms, and you may likely know what shipworms are. They are related to clams, but they burrow into wood and they smell really terrible if you try to throw them in a fire. A lot of people try to burn them in wood. Don't get driftwood off the beach with the big boreholes in it. Probably has shipworms in it. But they're used to assess the health of the environment. If it's an unhealthy environment, you won't see them. They won't colonize wood. So the middle picture is of the water at our dock in Heidelberg. There's plastic bags in there. There's oil on the water. It does not look very healthy. So our students developed traps or planks of wood. We dropped it in the water and left it for a year to allow shipworms to colonize it. And what we saw is from 12 meters down, we had some shipworms in there, and we know we have them because in the gill of the shipworm is a bacteria that creates a component or a compound, secondary metabolite, that keeps barnacles and sponges and algae, seaweed from growing. And so we have shipworms in here, but from about 10 meters up, we don't really have any shipworms. So what that tells us is from 10 meters up, we have contaminated water. Something is going on there. And so we did this study with students every year. We'd pull them out, throw new ones in. The fishermen were very kind. They did not like our traps at the dock. They were in their way, but they left them there, thankfully. And we did this study for 5 years. And we did it from 5th to 12th grade. So each grade did a different part of the science on this study. And after 5 years, we pulled all the data together, working with the students, and we made a report and we gave it to the tribe. And the tribe in turn was able to use that data to apply. They were applying for a grant from the state to do remediation and clean up the dock, and use that shipworm data to show that we did indeed have a contaminated environment. The tribe received a grant from the state and remediated the site. And the students immediately went out there, threw their traps back in the water, and because now there's ownership of this research, right? They've been doing it long enough. They want to know, did this change something? And they were so happy to see we actually did have colonization of the wood through the whole water column. So 4 tons of marine batteries and nets and buoys and refrigerators and sunken vessels and oil coming out of it was all there. And we were able to help with the students' data clean this site up. So they're very proud of it. And a lot of the work they do also, they work on all the rivers around the community, doing the same type of thing, but looking at a different organism. So what we try to do is provide a lot of place-based learning activities, because not every student's going to want to do everything. So we try to put enough things in place that is going to engage with the students. So we do science fairs. This is actually a 3D model of the Heidelberg watershed that the student built. And he's pouring water on there to show what logging would do if a river was logged. They go out and they collect macroinvertebrates from rivers. They get to go to conferences and put their research posters together and do talks. We've had 44 students go to ACES at different parts of the country every year. We provide internships and research opportunities either at different universities or with the tribe, because we want to keep the students in the community and we want to do workforce development for them as well. So if they choose to transition into working for the tribe, we're teaching them the skills to do that water quality assessment. We do inquiry-based and we do culturally aligned science. So getting to the community change, in the beginning of this project, we asked 70 students to close their eyes for a minute and try to clear your mind. It was just hard to do. You know, you got 5th to 12th graders, you're asking them to do this. And they're like, yeah, okay. And I'm going to say a word and I want you to open your eyes and just write the first 3 things you think of. 70 students had the same 7 words. A scientist is a white male, white only, male only. 60% of our students were female. Not one identified as a scientist. Lab coat, crazy glasses, bald, and then old. And so I realized right away that I had made a mistake. I had not served my students well. I was bringing in white scientists because I wanted them to see who we were as real people. Okay, I was trying to address some of that idea of who we are, but I didn't meet the needs of the students. So I started recruiting Indigenous scientists from around the country. So they were undergraduate students or graduate students or post, whoever, if they wanted to learn how to do this in their community, I would bring them to Heidelberg with me. And in 1 year of bringing, I think I brought 4 female scientists with me, engineering, oceanography, medical science, you name it. We asked that question again, and it had a very different response. In a word cloud, the biggest word is the word said the most, the smallest word is the word said the least. The shifts we see, smart, okay, scientist, male, female. Now our girls are saying, I can be a scientist too. Native is on here. So now a native can be a scientist. This is a complete shift in ideology in our students of what they can be. Yachtang, respect is in there. Core cultural value is now listed in there. This was amazing to see. And when I was looking at it again, I realized the smaller words again are something that's said maybe once or twice. But when we look at these small words, the ones that are represented the least, curly hair, tall and short, those are personal descriptors. That student is describing themselves as a scientist. And once it's amazing to see. So the student is now saying, I'm a scientist. And so we had this foundational shift in how the students viewed themselves and what they could do and be in this world using 2 knowledge systems, not just 1. We can't only work with our students though, because we're asking them to go out into colonized spaces in academia, which is spaces we occupy. So in the tribe, the foundation is on culture and language, but I work in academia. Since 2016 have been working with scientists on how to work with our Indigenous students in their classroom, how to acknowledge respectfully who we are, and how to acknowledge in their traditional knowledge systems respectfully. We also have to work with, and I work a lot with funding agencies, excuse me. I work a lot with NOAA, NASA, NSF, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife, because we have to train those program officers in these federal funding agencies on how to look at a proposal for a project that's going to work with us and not on us. The time of working on us is over. We can do our own research in our own communities when we should be allowed to do that. So training, money's policy. And so wherever they shift money to is what is allowed to happen. So working with federal agencies to teach them how to evaluate a proposal that's really working with a tribal community in consultation and partnership with a tribal community, not on a tribal community. So I work on a lot of different projects, trying to create these safe spaces, excuse me, for students. This year we founded and launched 5 weeks ago, the Indigenous Geoscience Community. That's an organization that brings all Indigenous people together so that we can do cross-cultural knowledge exchange. We all have water, we all have land, and we all have air. How do we do this differently? And how do we have, what are the commonalities in it? I'm part of the Indigenous Women's Water Sisterhood here in Duluth. We're training faculty in K-12, but also the general public on the history of Lake Superior in Minnesota. And I work on several projects to train faculty and to create a new generation of activists and students who have voice. Oftentimes we lose our voice, and we want to have our students empower them to maintain their voice and to have a voice that they know they can speak up. We have cultural responsibility, and it oftentimes puts us at odds with our expectation in academia. As an untenured faculty, I'm expected to just sit and watch. But on my cultural responsibility side, as a Haida woman, how can I do that? And so oftentimes I don't act the way I'm expected to, and that is okay. It's different for those that don't understand who I am, but it's okay, because at the end of the day, I have to say, did I do what I can live with? And I have chosen my cultural responsibility over my colonized academic professional expectations. So with that, I'll show you one last thing. 3 weeks ago. This mural went up in Seattle. There's an artist, and the website's on the bottom. She has been going around the country. This was the 6th mural. She's painting murals of diverse women in science, and she did one on the work that I do. And so this is 3 Haida women, air, land, and water, and they're pointing in a circle, showing the cyclical nature of traditional knowledge. And this was the first time we had public representation. It's a 30-foot high, 40-foot wide mural in Seattle. And I brought 50 students there and community members to see it, because we have a duality to this. We want to empower our students to see for the first time, hopefully not the last time, a public demonstration of traditional knowledge in a positive way, no deficit language associated with it. And we want our elders to see this as well, because we know I'm the first generation removed from boarding school. I know what education means to my mother. It does not mean something good. And I want to bring healing to how she sees education. And so this was a amazing thing to be able to bring these 2 generations together and experience this together and dedicate it in Seattle. We were also able to put our language on there and have it publicly viewable for the first time. You know, we don't have a lot of Haida speakers. And so being able to reclaim a space with our knowledge and reclaim a space with our language was really important to us. And so with that, I want to say how to the elders who have guided me along my pathway. These elders have all passed now, but the one thing they asked me to do is, if you're going to do this work, make sure you promise us you will protect our students. And that is my priority. Every time I work with students, my goal is to make sure that they move in safe spaces. And so with that, I'll say ha'a dangat kalag, and thank you so much.
Ha'a, Wendy, that was phenomenal. It was very, very inspiring. I think you really do lead by example. We have a lot to learn in terms of our local Haida Gwaii schools and our universities here in Canada. It's such important work that you're doing. So ha'a so much. So I guess we'll jump over to my presentation now. It's a hard act to follow, I'll be honest. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about my master's research and also my journey as a Haida scientist. I'll be touching on the difficulties as well, because I didn't have a lot of role models and I encountered the same difficulties that you described. So I really appreciate that you went first and kind of laid the foundation. But before I start, I am going to introduce myself as well. So hadala isis skiljada hinudi kyang jas keganga diau u ichang Sandra Adams dinan u ichan gamwe dinan atlin ul isangang gayalas guds u di kwatlagang di u yakujana skagang outlage aushnangang. So good people, I'm Vanessa Zanner, formerly known as Vanessa Fladmark. My mom's Sonia Rice. My nani was Sandra Adams. I'm from the Raven side. I'm Yakujanas clan, and I live here in Old Masset. And I'm really excited to talk to you guys about my research. And ha'a to Jusquan for helping me translate my thesis title into Hadkil. So it's called Gudash Hinangagang Chagutang Slu Chatan Hatan Inas Iskian Skuga Gatagangs, or Living Together, Young Pink and Chum Salmon Feeding During Hard Times. And ha'a to Sidanghal Shoshana Green for creating this beautiful artwork that I was able to use in my thesis. So hang on. I did my Master's of Science in Biological Oceanography at UBC, where I was able to study salmon. I also did my Earth and Ocean Science degree at UBC, where I didn't study salmon, but I studied herring diets a little bit. And it was a really interesting and difficult but amazing journey. And yeah, if I always am very honest about the positives and difficulties that I encountered as a Haida student. I was the first Indigenous person in my department, and I was part of 2 departments. Not their first one ever, but I was the only one entering that space in the Earth and Ocean Science Department and the Institute for Oceans and Fisheries. And during my graduate time in the graduate program, that changed, and that was amazing. But yeah, so I found it really hard to have this holistic perspective that was kind of central to my way of seeing the world, because I grew up here in Old Masset. And I was kind of initially drawn to oceanography because it did have a somewhat holistic view. It did kind of think of those geological features that shape our coasts, and it talked about the currents and the nutrients and how that impacts the different levels of the food chain and how species interact with one another. So that's why I was initially drawn to it. And of course, I was drawn to salmon because of their importance to us. And they're also just really fascinating creatures. Basically, they're eaten by almost everything. They're really important for all systems. They're a keystone species, which means they're integral and no one else can fill their role. So they bring nutrients from the ocean to freshwater, and they're important for land, ocean, and air. And they're just kind of, they're at the heart of everything, ecologically and culturally. So that's why I decided to focus on them. Yeah, so this is their life cycle, in case anyone needs a refresher. So they spawn in the rivers, of course, and then they head out towards the ocean, and then they complete their life cycle. And there are 5 main types of salmon. I looked at the juvenile phase because I thought it was a really important phase where they start out really small in the rivers and then they have to grow really quickly in the ocean. So it's a really vulnerable phase for them. They need to get a lot to eat and they deal with a lot of challenges in that part of their life cycle. So I wanted to dig into that to figure out more about their survival. Because, you know, as we know, our salmon are in decline just about everywhere. And so we need to figure out what is going on, because it's not as simple as too much fishing. They're facing a lot of different complex impacts. And I wanted to be able to make a difference by kind of diving headfirst into why that might be the case. So here are the 5 main types of salmon. There are also steelhead, which are another type of anadromous salmon, which means they spawn in rivers and go to the ocean. These 5 species, they die after spawning, so they complete their life cycle with like 1 migration, whereas steelhead, they can do multiple migrations and spawning events. So they're kind of in their own category evolutionarily. And Chinook and coho are really similar to one another. And then pink chum and sockeye, or dogfish salmon, or humpback salmon is their more commonly known name. They are more genetically similar to one another. They have a lot of feeding similarities, and they tend to head right out to the ocean for the most part, whereas Chinook and coho, they spend a little more time in freshwater. Excuse me. And so pink and chum salmon are also the most numerous out of all the salmon. So, they tend to be in higher numbers than the other species. And so, you know, sockeye, I would say, is my favorite type of salmon to eat. And sockeye are the ones who are really in decline in a lot of areas, whereas pink and chum aren't in as steep of a decline. So they're doing okay relative to these climate change impacts and all these other factors. And because these species are so similar, they have the potential to compete for food resources. And so if I figure out what's going on with pink and chum, we can kind of compare that and see how that impacts sockeye. But all species hold a lot of importance. Traditionally, we would have sockeye, chinook, and coho we would eat them fresh, whereas pink and chum were better for preserving for over the winter because of their lower fat and oil content. So all of these species were important to us, but in my master's research, I dove into pink and chum, or skugga and chat-an. And so because I was going to university down south, I didn't really have the luxury of studying Haida Gwaii, which was a big downside. I really wanted to get to know our local ecosystems, but I knew that studying salmon was important no matter where I did it. And we had data available for this region, which is between Campbell River and Port Hardy area. That's my study sites. I partnered up with a research program, the Hakai Institute. So they do salmon sampling of juveniles every year. And they had collected salmon from previous years. And my supervisors asked me if I wanted to research these fish that they had already collected. And I said yes, because I didn't want those salmon just sitting in the lab and their information not being utilized. You know, I take it very seriously in science when we have to kill the animals in order to study them. It's a very weird space to be in because I don't quite agree with it. It doesn't quite seem respectful to me. But, you know, if that is what happened to them, then the way that we can honor them is by using all the information that we can from them and really trying to make a positive difference and, you know, change some of our practices around salmon, build to the knowledge base, and to do better for salmon. So I really wanted my science to do that. And so in this area, it's Kwakwaka'wakw territory, and they're known as Hanun and Kwahnis. And so in my thesis, I did call them by their English name, pink and chum salmon, because it didn't feel right to call them one name, because I'm from Old Masset and I wanted to call them by their Haida names. But when I found them, they were passing through Kwakwaka'wakw territory. And so the really cool thing about salmon is they're known by all these different names all along the coast, and the diversity in the different names and the different spellings, it also speaks to their ecological diversity. So they have similarities in areas in terms of what we call them, and they have bigger differences the farther apart we go. And one really cool thing that I learned in my master's is that ecological and language restoration, they can often go hand in hand. So in places where people are reclaiming their language, they're also reclaiming their traditional stewardship, and vice versa. And I thought that that was really powerful. And, you know, there are quite a few of us oceanographers or marine biologists who are really passionate about language learning. And it's a little scary to speak Hadkill when I know I'm not doing it perfectly, but you know, we do our best because a lot of the knowledge of these ocean systems and these animals and these ecosystems are kind of locked away in our language, and we have to learn it in order to access it and pass it on. So I got to go to my study site later on in my master's program, and it was really beautiful there. And I got to sample some of the pink and chum myself. And so this is a chum. This is approximately the size of the salmon that I worked with. They were pretty small. They'd only been in the ocean for a couple months. And this is the area kind of north of Campbell River. It's known as the Discovery Islands, and the area farther north is known as Johnson Strait. And then, so this is the area again that I'm referring to. And there's also Queen Charlotte Strait. So there's a lot of these colonial names, you know, it reminds me of the old name of our islands, which I am not a fan of. And I don't know the traditional names of these places, but I always kept in mind that kind of the importance of place-based knowing, even if it wasn't my space to know and understand these areas specifically, because I'm not from these areas. I knew that there was a history here, and I tried to bring that into my science whenever I could. And I was sometimes told that it wasn't always appropriate to give such a lengthy background. People just want to talk about the salmon. They just want to talk about, you know, the raw data, the oceanography. So it was really interesting, and it became easier the further along I got in my master's, because I just got more confidence to know that the way that I saw the world was valid as well, and that it creates a richer wealth of knowledge. And just like Wendy said, like if we're trying to be good scholars, we have to look at all of the information, and we can't just ignore the past thousands of years. We just look at the most recent period of history, especially when it comes to salmon, because we really co-evolved with them. People were here before the last glaciers. The salmon were here before the last glaciers. And as the environment changed, we changed together. And so we really can't talk about salmon without talking about people as well, in a modern and a historical context. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the actual oceanography, just because I think it's really interesting. This is the temperature of the area I looked at. So it was really diverse. It was really, really warm down south, and it was really cool. And this is a really tough area for salmon survival, which is why I thought it was important to study, because all the salmon from the Fraser River have to go through this area. And it's known as like a bottleneck for survival. So it's like a really tough area, because usually in these warm areas, every spring you get a phytoplankton bloom, which is the algae, and that leads to the zooplankton blooms, which are the animals that are the salmon food. And that usually leads to good feeding success and healthy salmon who can grow quickly. Whereas in this like deeper, colder area, the water is so mixed by the tides. Excuse me. In BC, we have some of the strongest tides in the world, tidal currents. And because of this, it's really hard for the salmon to get the food that they need in this area. The phytoplankton aren't at the surface, so they can't photosynthesize. And so if there's no phytoplankton, then the zooplankton aren't able to grow, and the salmon have a really hard time feeding. So they're often don't get enough food in this area. So I wanted to like really dive into like what happens to them in these areas and how does it differ. So these are my different study sites, and I'll kind of show just a little bit of data on what I found them feeding on, how full were their stomachs, and what did this mean for salmon health. So I'll just explain a little bit about ocean conditions. I kind of already did, but the water kind of needs a stratification, like oil and water, they don't really mix together. And the same thing is true for like fresh water and salt water. They kind of like stay separate. And that warm surface layer leads to good food for salmon. And this mixed area is like that other area I explained where there's just not a lot of food for salmon because it just doesn't create good conditions for a really biodiverse and abundant life area. And there's also a very unique thing called a front where two different water masses meet and it kind of traps all these plankton together. So it can be really good feeding in one really small area. And we can even see it around here in northern Haida, like if like sometimes at the inlet in Old Masset or North Beach by Toe Hill, you can see two different colors of water coming together where you can have like this like dark brown where the river meets the ocean, which is like lighter blue. And usually sometimes you can see like fish jumping around in that area or like birds like diving around. And that means there's like really good food there, which also means that it's good for fish. And I thought I studied 2 different years. I studied a lot of salmon. I studied 312 juvenile salmon stomachs. That's how I figured out what they were eating and what that meant for the ecosystem. So I looked at May to July, which is their main out migration when they leave towards the ocean before they head north around the Gulf of Alaska and back. In 2015 and 2016, which were both really, really warm years because of that blob in the Pacific, as well as a La Nina event, which also makes the ocean warm. So I just want to show like a simplified version of kind of the importance of timing and how salmon have evolved to be matched with the prey that they encounter, but sometimes I can get thrown off by things like climate change, and the timing of seasons kind of gets thrown off. So we have phytoplankton blooming, and then we have these kind of small zooplankton, like water fleas or baby crabs and baby barnacles and fish eggs, and just all these small animals. And then later on in the season, we have some more of the carnivorous zooplankton, which eat the smaller zooplankton. So these are things like krill and copepods and these different types of worms, which are really good. They're rich in omega-3 fatty acids, which is great for salmon. So if they kind of migrate when they hit this zooplankton bloom, where there's lots of these big ones around, then they have a great time. And that's called a trophic match. It just means they encounter good food. And then if this doesn't happen, and the salmon head out earlier and they encounter a small zooplankton bloom, then it's kind of a mismatch. It's like trying to have nothing but pistachios for dinner. Like, you're not going to get fill and you're not going to get all the nutrients that you need. And it's just not going to be sufficient. So I wanted to figure out how the two different species, they kind of coped with these situations. Were the two different species unique? Did they have certain strategies? Like, how did they deal with these difficult conditions? So I looked at the different ocean conditions and these like good feeding or bad feeding scenarios is like the simplified version. I looked at it across the extent of the migration route, and I looked at the changes over time, as well as the species differences. So it's all very technical, and I really enjoyed that. Just gonna go off on a tangent here relating to my intro. Like, I really like the technical nitty gritty science stuff. And it was often like hard to work my indigeneity into that, because it was like the only time you could include indigenous stuff is if you were doing an indigenous study. They were like, you're doing social science, or you're using traditional knowledge. If you're using science knowledge, it's almost like they exist very separately. So I just kind of always carried it with me in everything. Just like Wendy mentioned, like, I am a Haida woman first, but I'm also a scientist. And so I studied these salmon stomachs, and I thought it was the coolest thing in the universe, because it was like seeing the world through the salmon's eyes in terms of like what they experience, what they eat, kind of how they deal with each other. Like, I found it very interesting, not just because of the strange creatures I saw under the microscope, but because it just kind of gave you a sense of what was going on. And I just always thought that was really cool. So this was kind of what I spent a year and a half doing of my master's. I would just cut open these salmon stomachs. I would weigh everything. I would count everything. I would measure everything. I would separate them by how digested they were. And I would identify everything to species, because like I said, I didn't want to just get a little bit of information. Like, I really wanted to maximize what I was getting from these fish, and every little detail mattered. Like, even in these tiny little creatures, I differentiated species when they were teeny tiny, even when looking under a microscope. And often it was really hard to tell things apart according to how digested they were. But it became like this cool puzzle that I was solving. And once you do figure out what species something is, it was like kind of like a thrill. So I thought that this was really cool, weird, unique work. And I kind of just fell in love with it. And it's kind of why I got into my master's. I did a little bit of this work in my bachelor's program. And then I worked for a year as a research tech, and I did my master's. And yeah, it was a lot of fun, surprisingly. And I have some more pictures at the end as well, just of weird, cool creatures. So what I saw for salmon food, I do have some of their technical names on here. But amphipods are like those little sand fleas. It's a little bit hard to see, but they're the guys that kind of jump around on the beach. There's marine species and there's land species. Euphausids are krill, decapods are crabs and their relatives, insects and spiders, jellyfish, oikopleura are a really interesting type of tunicate, and chaetonaths are those arrow worms. So we got pink on the top, we got chum on the bottom, and then from left to right, that's their migration route. And so calanoids are kind of like the main food source for fish. They're kind of like the insects of the sea, some people call them, just because they're so diverse and abundant and important. So that's what most of these guys are made of. They just have like a big body and a little tail. Excuse me. So just like the main thing that jumped out to me is just like the pink and chum diets are really, really different. The chum eat more jellyfish and this oikopleura creature, whereas the pink salmon ate more crustaceans like the baby crabs and insects and weird things that kind of live on the near shore, kind of in the tidal area. So oikopleura kind of look like tadpoles. They've got a big head and a long tail. They're also pretty decent food quality, kind of comparable to copepods, but the two species were eating differently, which means they had different strategies to deal with these difficult feeding conditions. So when times were tough, they kind of each went to a different food source. They each occupied a different space in the food web to kind of ease that pressure off of one another. And I think that helped some of their survival and their resilience to kind of survive together when times are really tough. They kind of evolved this strategy over time. And chum salmon are really unique in that they have bigger stomachs and they can utilize more from these jellyfish than the other species can. So they're very unique and very, very cool. And so the one exception where the species were the most similar was this last site, kind of near Port Hardy, where it was one of those frontal areas where there was a lot of zooplankton accumulating. So when people would go out to study there, they would see so many birds and so many whales, and it was just a feeding frenzy out there. So, so this kind of shows that when times are tough, they have different diets, but when things are good, they kind of eat more of the same things. They both eat krill, they both eat copepods. They kind of coexist together more easily, these two species. And so this is just, so that was across the migration route, and this is over time. This might be a bit technical, but I still just wanted to show off some of my data. So 2015 on the left, so the time is left to right. So then we have 2016. The first area is on top, the second area is on bottom. But basically it just showed that what I saw in that previous example, it kept true over time. So the chum were eating the jellyfish kind of all throughout both years in this one area, that really cold area. And then the pink salmon, they ate those copepods. So they were just totally different. You know, like I knew which species I was looking at as soon as I opened a stomach under the microscope. I didn't always need to look at the label to know whether it was pink or chum. And the story was a lot messier in this kind of warmer area where they have a lot more seasonal changes. And I won't dive deep into the data, but if anyone is interested, I can always share my big long thesis or talk more. I'm always happy to talk salmon. But there was just a lot of interesting trends here. But I'll keep it short. So I looked at how empty or how full the stomachs were, and I found that the stomachs were kind of empty. They were below average throughout most of this area. So the salmon are having a really hard time. And this was true of sockeye as well. One of my lab mates looked at the same time period, the same area for sockeye, and they were also empty stomachs, and then that one area where that feeding frenzy happened that I mentioned. So I thought that this was really interesting, and it's almost like it's possible that this one area kind of helps them recover from that really hard area. So they kind of just kind of push through that tough area, and then they kind of recharge. They spend a little bit more time in this area where they can kind of build up some more energy, and they can kind of keep going on their migration. And so if this area ever doesn't do well, like I think in 2007, there was a lot of rainfall and it was really warm, and it did change these conditions in this area. It hasn't been, it's been hypothesized, it hasn't been proven. They haven't dug into the data yet. But if it was really bad conditions in 2007, that could be one of the reasons that the 2009 sockeye salmon return that was so catastrophically low, this could have had a really big impact. So my research focused on later years, but I think that this area is really, really important. And this is just showing similarity between species, which I already spoke about. So the last graph that I'll show, thanks for sticking with me so late, is just the condition of the fish. So how healthy they were. So like how much did they weigh relative to their length is what this is measuring. So if they kind of hit 1, it means they're an average weight for the length that they are. If they're below this average level, that means they're really, really skinny and thin. And then if they're kind of higher, then it means they're well fed, they're happy, they're healthy. So in 2015, they were average. And then in 2016, they both did worse, both species. And this was for both sites, like both regions. And these just mean statistical differences, these little symbols here. And so in the year that they both did bad, the pink did worse than the chum, again, showing that resilience of relying on jellyfish works for them. Whereas the pink salmon are more at the whim of which crustaceans are available. If there's a lack of copepods, they really, really struggle. And that was the really warm year. And so it does have a negative impact on them when things get warmer. And they have an even tougher time in a tough area. And so that's what I already mentioned. So this is really interesting, and it has really big impacts for salmon survival overall. And that's why it's really important to kind of compare more than one species, to kind of think about ecosystem effects rather than just looking at one species and not getting the whole picture. And so I also looked at, the temperature and the salinity and how that changed, or the level of saltiness, and the zooplankton in the area. So I looked at like all these different things, and it was really, really complicated, but I'm just giving you all the highlight here. So my main takeaway was that they utilized different feeding strategies under these really harsh conditions. And this is likely true of other areas as well, but this region is just really unique in that it really has those big stark differences in kind of ocean conditions and health of salmon. So it's an important area that needs to be continued to be studied. And it also just emphasizes the importance of the young salmon. It's kind of like a make or break in their life cycle. So we need to put more research into what zooplankton are available for salmon to eat for them to do really well. And if we kind of monitor that, then we can kind of predict adult salmon returns better, and we can better manage them and make sure we don't take more than we need. And so, what I found was true in these really different areas and across multiple time periods. So I knew that this trend was like really substantial. And I thought that it was like really interesting. These are some of the creatures that I found under the microscope. Some of the common prey, so jellyfish, and then those chetonaths or arrowworms, the oikopleura. Baby crabs kind of look like little aliens when they're younger. These are baby krill. These are different types of copepods. They have a really big diversity in what size they are and how they look. Baby barnacles, cladocerans or water fleas. There was all different kinds of things. And in that 2015 year, they ate a lot more of the smaller stuff. And in 2015, they ate more of that bigger, juicy, good food. So they had like a prey match, which was really good for them. And then they also had like barnacles themselves, which showed that they were eating really close to shore. They had starfish larvae, alien acanthomyces, so a type of mysid named after aliens, just weird copepod, skeleton shrimp, fish eggs, a large fish, which was weird for a juvenile salmon, like its belly was full of fish. So, I was always just finding new and crazy things. I found a bunch of plastics. This one is potentially a piece of a straw. It was very thin and flimsy material like a straw, and it was bright blue, kind of big like a milkshake straw. Microfibers, small plastic pieces. So there was a lot to do with like salmon health and the kind of threats that they face. And like, it was both why I thought my research was important, was because of all these like threats and health impacts and this kind of thing. And also that was why it was really hard, is sometimes I would get really disheartened at the state of salmon when I was researching them. and kind of what salmon had to deal with. So, you know, the reason I pushed through was, again, because I needed to honor the salmon's lives who were used in my study. Like, I needed to finish for the salmon, not just for me, you know, like, I don't think that I needed my master's, like the degree itself for my job or anything like that. It was just like, yeah, it just felt like the right thing to do was to kind of finish what I started, and to be able to share it and to have it be important. And so there was also all different kinds of insects in there. It's funny, we only had zooplankton identification books, so I had to kind of figure out how to identify all these insects on my own. And so there was, yeah, it was really, really interesting. And that's, I'm just going to cut it off there. How for listening, everyone. Sorry if it was a little rambly. I'm tired from the House of Assembly. But you can reach out to me at my email down at the bottom if you want to read my thesis, if you want to talk more, if you want more in-depth technical stuff, or if you're thinking about grad school or science or anything, just feel free to reach out. Yeah, so how everyone, I hope that was interesting and rewarding.
How that was great. I want to tell you, my
Yeah.
research site in on Prince of Wales, you know, I look at geochemistry and microbiology. I found the similar thing from 2015 to 2016 because it was a La Nina El Nino event.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, ooh, we had to talk.
Yeah, totally. Amazing. Yeah, really, really interesting. I guess
That was so amazing, you two, and that was super relatable, and I'm so happy to have you two together. It kind of went perfect in the flow of all of this, and I'm really happy to have you guys on this. I am going to ask Wendy to answer that one question by Dan, and I will read it. I'll read it out very quickly here. And so Dan started by saying that he was wondering how we can get some cultural awareness and sensitivity training for government employees. And then how can we teach government employees that work day to day within our Haida government? Wendy had answered, and I'm just going to ask Wendy to put her answer live.
Yeah. So what I in the chat, I had mentioned a couple things that we do with federal employees is one, doing workshops. So engaging with a program officer or one of the employees and just asking for the potential to do a workshop, and just providing, like, we start with the most basic foundational knowledge of what is a tribe? What does our tribal government look like? We're very complicated compared to the United States, right? It's pretty linear. And then when you look at from us to the president, it's very linear. When we look at us to the tribal president, there can be a lot of people in between. So giving just basic information about the structure, and then building on that with additional workshops of what sovereignty is, the fact that a tribe isn't split by state lines. State lines are superficial. Like we provide very basic information, and they don't usually know that. So one is just doing workshops and building on it through time, because it takes more than one intervention to learn who we are. Unfortunately, you know, a lot of people want to do cultural competency in one workshop. That's not going to happen. You have to really invest time in it. And if you're going to do diversity work, it's equal importance as your science. You got to spend a lot of time in it. The other thing is we have a series of documentaries that we've been doing. A colleague of mine from the University of Rhode Island, we have 3 documentaries. One is on belonging in science. One is on allies and allyship. And what does that mean? Do you proclaim yourself an ally, or are you go through training and you go from a mentee to an ally, and it takes time. And then the third film is on decolonizing science. And what we do is those videos are leased out to universities and federal agencies. And the people that were in the videos, we do discussion panels. So we've done 3 of these with NOAA. They watch the video ahead of time. They get 2 or 3 days to watch it. And then we do a discussion panel on it, and they list a bunch of questions, and we have a dialogue back and forth. So there's a couple different ways of doing it. More of an interactive way where they always have a voice to discuss it. You don't want people to just listen. You want them to engage. So we have a small discussion session, and then we have smaller group breakouts. So anytime you can do that, you can build those relationships. And the first thing we have to do is pull that fear down. There's a lot of fear around learning diversity work and admitting that we don't know everything. So that's just a couple different things that we do, is workshops, and then using videos to lead to discussion groups.
How Wendy, how skill Jada. This has been really great. And I'd like to invite Raven to close with the prayer, as I'm not seeing any more questions, but lots of great comments of this coming from Haida's and bringing this knowledge forward. Anything either of you like to say before Raven closes?
I just think there is a question in the chat, another one for Wendy. No questions directed towards me. So maybe we can tackle that because we have a few minutes. But also just how about Wendy, how about everyone?
I'm looking at the question, sorry. Creating a cultural resource kit that elementary teachers can access on the island. So a couple things with that, I guess, is working with, again, if you're working with elders, you want to develop those cultural resources in consultation with the community, of course, and then getting permission to incorporate that into a curriculum. And one of the ways we do it is we'll ask our elder, what do you want the teachers to know, or what do you want people to know? And then they tell us, and then we say, is there a story we can link to that, like a publicly disseminated, publicly available traditional story we can link to it? And so we put those together and say, here's the story, and here's the lesson it's teaching you. And so then when the students read that, it reinforces that learning, but also teaches the teachers and external members or people wanting to work with the community who we are, by using one of our own knowledge systems and one of our own stories. But always doing that with consultation from the elders and from the tribe, especially if they have an IRB or internal review board. You want to make sure you have all the right permissions to use that knowledge and to disseminate it, and always give credit to those that willingly give their knowledge. You know, if they're sharing and teaching you how to use that knowledge and how to put this material together, make sure that we acknowledge them always. But tying it with traditional stories is a really good way. And the other thing we do is visual. We tie art to it. We ask students in the community to, what does this story tell you? And can you illustrate that in art? And so we tie art into it too, because a lot of the times when you think of things, you're thinking visually. And so if we can tie an art project or a piece of art to a lesson, that also reinforces that learning. I hope that's helpful.
That was a nice full answer. I really enjoyed that. Hello, Wendy.
Yeah, and I would just like to say how, again, for both of you, it's really nice to see and learn from fellow Haida women. It's really exciting for this webinars that's going on. I know that we were supposed to have Barb with us as well. She sends her apologies, like Vanessa mentioned. We had our annual House of Assemblies the past week and a half, and so she wasn't able to make it this time, but hopefully we'll have her again. And so I will end this off with a gratitude prayer. So hala talang singa su. Solana gudnang eat kaidagas, a chayat nunga hulkit laga, gandlai wadlukan scoutigi dunga hulkit laga. Itla olnagai scoutigi dunga hulkit laga. Itla gatagai scoutigi dunga hulkit laga. It yakalang at good at igawai scoutigi dunga hulkit laga. Ginaskanagwas laskun itki tulgat. Tulwadlhan fulkingait la hawa.
how Raven, and how everybody for joining tonight.